The dusty road that wound its way toward the main gate of the ranch was not merely a path of dirt and gravel, but a vein that carried the lifeblood of the Texas hill country directly to the heart of the Strait family home. Under the fading light of a brutal July sun, the dust suspended in the air turned into a haze of burnt orange and deep violet, hanging over the mesquite trees like a heavy curtain that refused to fall. It was the kind of evening where the heat did not dissipate with the setting sun, but instead settled into the earth, baking the soil until it cracked and pleaded for rain that the forecast promised would not come for another month. George sat on the wide wraparound porch that had been his sanctuary for decades. At 71, the man known to the world as the King of Country was simply a husband, a father, and a rancher watching the daylight surrender to the encroaching night. He wore his favorite resistol hat, not for show, but out of a lifetime of habit. The brim pulled low enough to shade his eyes from the dying glare of the horizon. His boots, scuffed and worn from a morning spent Checkle fence lines, rested on the railing. Beside him, in the matching rocking chair that had weathered just as many storms as he had, sat Norma. They did not need to speak. After 50 years of marriage, silence was a language they spoke more fluently than English. It was a comfortable silence, usually filled with the ambient sounds of the ranch, the chirping of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night, the rhythmic rasp of the cicadas in the live oaks. But tonight, the silence was different. It was heavy. It pressed against George's chest with a physical weight, thick and suffocating. George took a sip of his iced tea, the condensation on the glass cold against his calloused fingers, and frowned. He tilted his head slightly, listening. The cicadas had stopped. The crickets were mute. Even the wind, which usually whispered through the tall grass at this hour, had died down completely. The stillness was absolute, unnatural, and profoundly disturbing. It was as if the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something to break. He looked over at Norma. She was staring out toward the south pasture, past the manicured lawn and into the darkening brush where the old orchard stood. Her profile was illuminated by the soft, yellow glow of the porch light that had just flickered on automatically. Usually, her face held a serene expression in the evenings, a quiet contentment of a life well lived, but tonight her features were rigid. Her hands were gripping the armrests of the rockers so tightly that her knuckles were white, standing out starkly against the dark wood. George placed his glass down on the small table between them, the clink of the glass sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He leaned forward, concern etching deep lines into his forehead. He reached out and gently covered her hand with his, feeling the coldness of her skin despite the lingering heat of the evening. "Norma, honey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The same voice that had calmed horses and captivated stadiums, now filled with a tender worry. Norma did not blink. She did not turn to look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the porch, her gaze piercing through the shadows as if she were seeing something that the physical world had hidden away. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, a sharp contrast to the stillness around them. Then the temperature dropped. It was not a gradual cooling of the evening air. It was instantaneous. One second, the air was a humid 90 degrees. The next, a chill swept across the porch that made the hair on George's arms stand up. It was a cold that seeped through his denim shirt and settled in his bones, the kind of cold one feels when walking past an open grave in winter. Preserve the original language of the text, and started to stand up to get a blanket, thinking Norma must be freezing, but before he could rise, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile as dried leaves. "Alguien me llamó por mi nombre," she whispered, slipping into the Spanish she often used when emotions ran too deep for English. Someone called my name. George froze, half standing. He looked around the empty porch, then out into the yard. The security lights hadn't been triggered. The dogs, usually alert to even a rabbit crossing the perimeter, were nowhere to be seen, likely hiding under the barn, sensing the same strangeness that had silenced the insects. "I didn't hear anything, Norma," George said gently, sitting back down but keeping his hand on hers. "It's just the house settling, or maybe the wind playing tricks in the eaves. You know how this old place talks to itself sometimes." Norma turned to him then, and the look in her eyes stopped George's heart for a beat. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was a desperate, aching hope that terrified him more than any fear could. Her eyes were glassy, shimmering with unshed tears that caught the porch light. "It wasn't the house, George," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "And it wasn't you. It was a voice I haven't heard with my ears in almost 40 years. But my heart has heard it every single day." George felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew exactly who she was talking about. They rarely spoke her name out loud in moments like this, not because they wanted to forget, but because the pain was a living thing that lived in the walls of their home, a shadow that walked beside them. Jennifer, their little girl, gone since 1986. "Norma, please," George said, his voice cracking slightly. "Don't do this to yourself. The grief, it plays tricks on us. It's been a long day. The heat, maybe you're dehydrated. Let's go inside. I'll make you some supper." But Norma was already moving. She stood up with a fluidity that belied her age, her movements trance-like. She stepped off the porch, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path that led away from the house. She wasn't looking at the ground. Her chin was lifted, her head cocked slightly to the side, as if she were following an invisible thread of sound. "Norma!" George called out, panic rising in his chest. He grabbed the heavy flashlight he kept by the door and scrambled down the steps after her. The darkness beyond the reach of the porch light was absolute, a wall of black ink. He caught up to her near the edge of the manicured lawn where the wild Texas brush began. He reached out and took her arm, intending to turn her back toward the safety of the house. "Norma, stop! You can't go wandering out there in the dark. There are snakes, there are holes. Please, come back." Norma stopped, but she didn't turn back. She looked at him, her face pale in the beam of his flashlight. "Listen, George. Just listen." George shook his head, frustration warring with concern. "There is nothing to hear. The bugs have stopped, that's all. It's probably a storm coming in." "Shh," she hissed, pressing a finger to his lips. "Listen." George sighed, ready to pick her up and carry her back to the house if he had to. He couldn't let her wander into the rough terrain in this state. He closed his eyes for a second, composing himself, preparing to be the rock she needed, the sensible one. And then he heard it. At first, he thought it was the blood rushing in his ears, a low, rhythmic thrumming. But then the sound separated itself from his own physiology. It was coming from the direction of the old dry creek bed, about a quarter-mile into the property. It wasn't the wind. It had a pitch, a cadence. It was a melody. George's breath caught in his throat. The flashlight beam wavered in his shaking hand. The sound was faint, drifting on the unnaturally cold breeze, but it was unmistakable. It was a humming sound. A young girl's voice, light and airy, humming a tune that George knew better than the beat of his own heart. It was the melody of Baby Blue, the song he had sung for her, the song that had become an anthem for his daughter, the song that, for years, he couldn't sing on stage without feeling like his chest was being ripped open. "No," George whispered, stepping back, his boot scraping against a rock. "That's not possible. That's a radio. Someone is out there playing a radio.
Trespassers. He tried to rationalize it. He tried to force the logic of the physical world onto the impossible moment. Fans sometimes tried to sneak onto the ranch. It had to be that. Someone with a cruel sense of humor playing his own song back to him in the dark. But deep down, George knew. The timbre of the humming was not George Strait's voice coming from a speaker. It was higher, softer. It had the imperfect, beautiful pitch of a 13-year-old girl absent-mindedly singing to herself while brushing a horse. Norma was already walking again. She pulled her arm free from his grasp and moved toward the sound with a determination that frightened him. She wasn't walking like an elderly woman anymore. She was moving with the urgency of a mother who hears her child crying in the night. "Wait, Norma, wait for me!" George shouted, abandoning his attempt to stop her. He realized he couldn't stop this. He could only protect her. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and hurried to her side, matching her pace. They entered the orchard. The peach trees, gnarled and twisted by years of drought, loomed like skeletons in the flashlight's beam. The air here was even colder, a sharp, biting frost that had no business existing in a Texas July. George could see his breath puffing out in white clouds before him. The humming grew louder. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it was a presence. It seemed to wrap around them, weaving through the branches of the trees. "Do you hear her, George?" Norma asked, her voice breathless as they navigated the uneven ground. "Do you hear our baby?" "I hear it," George admitted, his voice trembling. "I hear it, Norma." The skepticism that had been the foundation of his sanity for the last few minutes began to crumble. He remembered the last time he had seen Jennifer, the smile on her face, the innocence. He remembered the phone call that shattered their world. He remembered the years of silence, the empty chair at the table, the birthdays that came and went with a dull ache. He had made peace with the loss, or so he thought. He had found a way to live with the hole in his heart. But this sound, this humming, it was reaching into that hole and pulling out memories he thought he had buried under layers of time and acceptance. As they moved deeper into the property, the terrain became rougher. The ground sloped downward toward the creek. This creek had been dry for 3 years. It was nothing more than a scar in the earth, filled with dust and tumbleweeds. George knew every inch of it. He knew where the drop-offs were, where the rocks were loose. "Be careful, watch your step," George guided her, shining the light at her feet. But Norma didn't seem to need the light. She was moving with a supernatural grace, stepping over roots and rocks without looking down. The humming shifted. It stopped being a hum and started becoming words. Faint, whispered lyrics carried on the impossible wind. And baby blue was the color of her eyes. George stopped dead in his tracks. He grabbed a tree branch to steady himself. The voice was clear now. It was Jennifer. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't a recording. It was fresh, alive, present. It sounded exactly as she did the day before she died. Norma turned to him, tears streaming down her face, glowing in the reflected light. "She's calling us to the creek, George. She's waiting." Preserve the original language of protective instinct mixed with terrifying awe. He didn't know what was waiting for them at the creek. Was it a ghost? A hallucination? Or were they both losing their minds simultaneously, sharing a delusion born of decades of suppressed grief? "It doesn't matter," he thought. "If Norma is going, I am going. I will walk into hell itself if she leads the way." "Let's go," George said, his voice firming up. He took her hand again, interlacing his fingers with hers. "I'm right here. I'm not letting go." They descended the slope toward the creek bed. The vegetation here was dense, the mesquite thorns tearing at their clothes, but they didn't feel it. The cold was intense now, a winter freeze that numbed their faces. The static electricity in the air was palpable. The hair on George's arms was standing straight up,
and he could feel a tingling sensation on his skin, like the air before a lightning strike. As they broke through the final line of brush that guarded the creek bank, George prepared himself to see the dry, dusty trench he had ridden his horse past just yesterday. He prepared himself to see nothing but darkness and rocks. But as the flashlight beam cut through the foliage and hit the space where the creek should have been, George gasped. The flashlight slipped from his hand and tumbled to the ground, its beam spinning wildly before settling on a patch of grass. He didn't need the flashlight anymore. The creek was not dry. It was flowing. But it wasn't flowing with water. It was flowing with light. A river of liquid silver, shimmering and glowing with a soft, ethereal luminescence, was coursing through the old riverbed. It moved silently, without the splash and gurgle of water, but with the fluid motion of a tide. The light it cast was gentle, illuminating the surrounding trees in a pale blue-white hue. George stood paralyzed. His cowboy logic, his pragmatism, his understanding of how the world worked, it all evaporated in the face of the miracle flowing before him. He looked at Norma. She wasn't surprised. She was smiling, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy that took 20 years off her face. "Look across, George," she whispered, pointing to the other side of the glowing stream. George lifted his eyes. The mist on the other side of the creek was thick, swirling in patterns that defied the wind. Slowly, the mist began to part. It didn't dissipate, it moved aside like curtains on a stage. And there, standing on the opposite bank with her back to them, was a figure. She was small, slight of build. She was wearing a simple summer dress, the kind that was popular in the mid-'80s, pale yellow with small flowers. Her hair was long, dark, and tied back with a blue ribbon. George's knees buckled. He grabbed Norma's shoulder to keep from falling. The breath left his lungs in a ragged sob that he couldn't suppress. He knew that posture. He knew that hair. He knew the way she stood, with one foot slightly turned in. "Jennifer?" George choked out, the word tearing from his throat like a physical object. The figure didn't turn immediately. She stood there, looking out into the dark woods on the other side, as if she were waiting for permission. Norma stepped closer to the edge of the flowing light. "Jennifer, baby, it's Mama, we're here!" The figure slowly began to turn. The movement was graceful, unhurried. As she turned, the light from the creek seemed to rise up and illuminate her face. It was her. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't transparent. She looked solid, real, healthy. She looked exactly as she had on her best days. There were no scars, no signs of the accident that had taken her. She was perfect. She was 13 years old, frozen in time, yet radiating a wisdom that seemed ancient. She looked across the river of light, her eyes locking onto George's. Those eyes, the eyes he had sung about. The eyes he saw every time he closed his own. She smiled. It wasn't a sad smile. It was a smile of welcome. "Hi, Daddy," she said. Her voice carried across the gap without effort, clear as a bell, bypassing George's ears and resonating directly in his soul. George fell to his knees in the dirt. The mighty king of country, the man who had stoically weathered the highs and lows of fame, broke down completely. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. The pain of 37 years, the grief he had packed away in boxes and songs and busy schedules, came rushing out all at once. "It's real," he sobbed into his hands. "God in heaven, it's real!" Norma dropped to her knees beside him, but she wasn't crying in pain. She was crying in relief. She wrapped her arm around his shoulders. "Look at her, George. Look at our girl. She's beautiful."
George forced himself to look up. He couldn't waste a second of this. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, his vision blurring and clearing. Jennifer was still there, watching them with patience and love. "Why?" George asked, his voice hoarse. "Why now? Why are you here?" Jennifer took a step toward the edge of the bank. The silver light reflected in her eyes. "Because you needed to know," she said softly. "You've been carrying the heavy load too long, Daddy, both of you. The road has been dusty and long, hasn't it?" George nodded, unable to speak. The metaphor hit him hard. The dusty road, his life. The endless tours, the miles, the applause that couldn't fill the silence of a lost child. "I missed you," George whispered. "Every day, every single day." "I know," Jennifer said. "I hear you when you sing. I'm always in the front row, Daddy. You just couldn't see me because the lights were too bright. But tonight, the lights are down." Norma stood up then. She looked at the flowing river of light separating them. She looked at her daughter, so close, yet separated by this barrier of supernatural energy. The longing in Norma's body was palpable. She took a step toward the creek. "I want to hold you," Norma said, her voice desperate. "I need to hold you, baby, just once, please." George's survival instinct kicked in through the haze of emotion. He scrambled up and grabbed Norma's hand. "Norma, no, we don't know what that is. You can't just walk into it." He looked at the water. It looked like pure energy. He was terrified that if Norma touched it, she would be gone forever. That this was the boundary between the living and the dead, and crossing it meant there was no coming back. "It's okay, George," Norma said, her eyes fixed on Jennifer. "Look at her. She's waiting." George looked at Jennifer. She extended her hand across the water. "Come here, Mama," Jennifer said. George tightened his grip on Norma. "No, Jennifer, tell her she can't come. It's not her time." George was in a panic. He was terrified that this was a trick, a lure. He was terrified that he was about to lose his wife to the same darkness that had taken his daughter. He pulled Norma back, his boots sliding in the dirt. "I can't lose you too, Norma," George pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I can't do this alone. Don't leave me." Jennifer's expression softened. She looked at her father with infinite compassion. She raised her hand, palm out, a gesture of peace. "Daddy, listen to me," she said. Her voice was firmer now, commanding the space. "Let her come. It's just a hug. It's just a moment. It's not her time to stay. Not yet. But she needs this to keep going, and so do you." George looked from his daughter to his wife. He saw the desperation in Norma's eyes, the absolute need to touch her child. He realized then that denying her this might be worse than death. Living with the proximity but without the contact would destroy her spirit. He looked at the flowing light. It didn't look dangerous anymore. It looked inviting. It looked like grace. George loosened his grip on Norma's hand. He didn't let go completely, but he stopped pulling. He looked at her, his eyes asking a silent question. "Are you sure?" Norma nodded. "I trust her, George. She's our daughter." George took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He stepped up beside Norma. "Then we go together," he said. "If you cross, I cross. I'm not standing on this bank watching you go." Norma smiled and squeezed his hand. Together. They stepped to the edge of the bank. The silver light swirled faster, as if anticipating their arrival. The air crackled. George felt a vibration in his teeth, in his bones. Jennifer stepped into the creek from the other side. She didn't sink. She stood on top of the light for a moment. Then, slowly, her feet submerged.
not into water, but into the glow. She waded toward the middle. "Come on," she beckoned.
Preserve the original language of the text, off the solid earth and into the unknown. The moment George's boot broke the surface of the luminous stream, he expected the shock of cold water. He braced himself for the soak of the denim, the squelch of mud, the physical reality of a Texas creek bed. But the sensation that flooded his body was unlike anything he had encountered in 71 years of life on this earth. It was not wetness. It was not temperature. It was a vibration, a hum that started in the soles of his feet and shot upward through his legs like a bolt of pure, refined adrenaline mixed with a heavy dose of morphine. The pain in his knees, the dull ache in his lower back from years of riding and performing, the stiffness in his knuckles, it all vanished instantly. The light that swirled around his ankles felt like liquid silk, or perhaps like walking through a dense, low-hanging cloud that carried a charge of static electricity. He looked down. His boots were not wet. They were glowing. The silver light seemed to be examining him, recognizing him, welcoming him. It clung to the leather without saturating it, casting upward shadows on his face that made him look younger, smoothing out the deep lines of worry and age. Beside him, Norma gasped. It was a sound of pure physical relief. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. George looked at her and saw that she was no longer trembling. Her posture had straightened. The frailty that had begun to creep into her frame over the last few years had evaporated. She was standing tall, her eyes fixed on the figure in the middle of the stream, her face bathed in the ethereal blue-white glow. "It feels like memory," Norma whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "George, can you feel it? It feels like the day we brought her home from the hospital. It feels like Christmas morning in 1975. It feels like every good thing we ever lost." George nodded, unable to find the words. He was a man of lyrics, a man who had sung about every heartbreak and every joy known to the human condition. But there were no lyrics for this. He tightened his grip on Norma's hand, anchoring her to him, anchoring himself to her. They were two castaways stepping into a river of time, and he was terrified that the current would sweep one of them away. They took another step. The substance, this river of light, rose to their shins. It offered no resistance. It didn't drag at their legs like water would. Instead, it seemed to propel them forward, urging them toward the center, toward the girl who stood waiting with infinite patience. Jennifer hadn't moved. She stood in the deepest part of the channel, where the light reached her waist. The mist that swirled around her was thicker there, obscuring the far bank, making it seem as though the world beyond her simply didn't exist. There was only the ranch behind them and the girl in front of them. George's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. Every instinct in his body, every protective alarm bell that a father possesses, was ringing. He was walking his wife toward the dead. He was walking himself toward a confrontation with the one grief he had never truly conquered. He wanted to stop, to pull Norma back to the safety of the dirt and the dry grass, but the pull of the girl's eyes was stronger than gravity. As they waded deeper, the sounds of the ranch faded completely. The silence was absolute, save for the sound of their own breathing and the soft, melodic humming that Jennifer had resumed. It was Baby Blue again, but now it wasn't just a melody, it was a conversation. The notes hung in the air, visible shimmers of gold mixing with the silver stream. "Jennifer?" George called out again, his voice breaking. "We're coming, honey, we're coming." The girl smiled, and for the first time, George saw the details that photographs could never capture. He saw the tiny scar on her chin from when she fell off her bicycle at age 6.
He saw the way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right when she was amused. He saw the specific shade of blue in her eyes, not the pale blue of the sky, but the deep, complex blue of a Texas bluebonnet field at dusk. "Don't rush, Daddy," Jennifer said. Her voice did not echo. It sounded as if she were standing right next to his ear. "We have time. For the first time in a long time, we have time." They reached the middle of the creek bed. The light was now at their thighs. George stopped. He felt a resistance now, not physical, but spiritual, a barrier. He sensed that they were standing on a precipice, a borderline between the land of the living and something else. He felt that if they took one more step, they might not be able to turn back. He pulled gently on Norma's hand, halting her. "Norma, wait," he choked out. Norma turned to him, her eyes wide and frantic. "Why? She's right there, George. I can almost touch her. Let me go." "No, listen to me," George pleaded, turning her to face him, gripping her shoulders with both hands. He ignored the strange sensation of the light swirling around them. "You have to listen. I love you more than my own life, Norma, and I love her. God knows I love her. But I am terrified. Look at this place. Look at her. This isn't a dream. This is the edge, Norma." He took a ragged breath, tears spilling freely now. "If we touch her, if we cross that line, I don't think we go back to the porch. I don't think we wake up tomorrow. And I'm not ready for you to go. I can't let you go yet." Norma looked at him, and the frantic need in her eyes softened into a heartbreaking sadness. She reached up and touched George's cheek. His skin felt rough and warm under her fingers. "George," she said softly, "look at me. I'm tired. I've been tired for 37 years. Part of me died that day in San Marcos. You know that. You've lived with a ghost of a wife for half your life. You've been patient. You've been strong. You carried the ranch, the career, the family. But my heart has been over there with her since 1986. She turned back to Jennifer, extending her hand toward the girl. "If this is the end, George, if this is my time, then I accept it. I can't be this close and not hold her. I can't. It would kill me anyway to turn back now." George looked at his wife, really looked at her. He saw the weariness she spoke of. He saw the shadow that had lived behind her smile at every awards show, every family dinner, every Christmas. He realized with a crushing weight that he had been holding her together with his own strength for decades, and she was right. To deny her this, even if it meant death, was a cruelty he could not commit. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of surrender. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." He released her shoulders, but kept a tight grip on her hand. "Then we do it. But I'm holding on to you. If you go, I go. That's the deal." Norma smiled, a radiant, youthful smile. "That's the deal, cowboy." They turned together to face Jennifer. She was only 5 feet away now. She was watching their exchange with a look of profound love and maturity. She didn't look like a child anymore. She looked like an old soul wearing the guise of a child. Jennifer raised both her hands. "Stop," she commanded gently. They froze. "You don't have to die to hold me, Mama," Jennifer said. Her voice was firm, cutting through George's fear like a knife. "That's not why I'm here. I didn't come to take you. I came to give you something back." She took a step toward them. The light rippled away from her waist. "You think death is a wall," Jennifer continued, looking deep into George's eyes. "You think it's a door that locks from the outside. But it's not. It's a veil, Daddy. It's thin. Thinner than the paper you write your songs on. Sometimes, when the love is heavy enough, and the grief is loud enough, and the night is quiet enough, the veil tears. Just a little.
Just for a moment. She took another step. She was within arm's reach now. The wind, the silence, the stopping of the cicadas, that was the tear, Jennifer explained. God allowed it. Because you've been singing to me for so long, Daddy. And Mama has been whispering to me every night before she sleeps. I heard you. I always heard you. George felt his knees shaking. The proximity to her was overwhelming. He could smell her. It wasn't the smell of the creek or the outdoors. It was the scent of vanilla and baby powder, the scent of the shampoo she used to use. It was a sensory memory made manifest. Jennifer, George managed to say, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. This was the guilt that had eaten at him. The irrational, illogical guilt of a father who believes he should be able to stop the world from turning if it means protecting his child. Jennifer shook her head slowly. No, Daddy, don't you carry that. You never dropped me. You never let me down. The accident, it was just a moment. It was a blink. 1 second I was in the car, and the next I was in the light. There was no pain. There was no fear. I was just home. She looked at Norma. But I see what it did to you. I see the gray in your hair, Mama. I see the way you hold my old ribbon. Norma sobbed, pulling the blue ribbon from her pocket. She had been clutching it so tightly it was warm. I kept it. I kept everything. I know, Jennifer said softly, but you don't need the ribbon to hold me. Jennifer opened her arms wide. The gesture was so inviting, so purely affectionate, that it broke the last of George's resistance. Come here, she said. Norma didn't wait. She lunged forward, splashing through the light, and collided with her daughter. George expected her to pass through. He expected her to grasp at smoke. But there was a sound, a solid, soft thump of bodies colliding. Norma wrapped her arms around Jennifer's waist, burying her face in the girl's neck. Jennifer wrapped her arms around Norma's shoulders, resting her cheek on her mother's gray head. It was solid. It was real. George stood there, arm's length away, witnessing the impossible. He saw his wife's hands pressing into the fabric of the yellow dress. He saw Jennifer's fingers tangling in Norma's hair. He saw the rise and fall of their breathing as they held each other. It was a tableau of pure redemption. The years of separation, the cold nights, the empty holidays, they were all dissolving in the heat of this embrace. Daddy, Jennifer said, lifting her head and looking at George over Norma's shoulder. Her eyes were wet with tears now, shining like diamonds. George couldn't move. He felt unworthy. He felt that this moment belonged to the mother and child.
And he was just the spectator. But Jennifer wouldn't let him stay on the sidelines. You need this too, George Strait, she said, using his full name with a playful mock severity that she used to use when she was 12. Get in here. George took the final step. He reached out his long arms and wrapped them around both of them. He felt the smallness of his daughter's frame, the fragility that he remembered. He felt the warmth of her life force. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of vanilla, and let out a roar of grief and love that had been trapped in his chest for decades. He cried like he hadn't cried since the funeral. He cried for the songs he wrote for her. He cried for the silence of the house. He cried for the grandchildren she never gave them. He cried for the unfairness of it all. And as he cried, he felt her hand rubbing his back. A small, comforting circle right between his shoulder blades. It's okay, she whispered. It's okay to let it go. You don't have to be the king here. You can just be my dad. They stood there, the three of them, huddled together in a river of silver light, in the middle of a dry Texas creek, while the universe held its breath. Time seemed to stop completely. It could have been a minute. It could have been an hour. It didn't matter.
The timeline of their lives had been paused for this act of mercy. Slowly, the intensity of the embrace loosened. Norma pulled back just enough to cup Jennifer's face in her hands. She studied every inch of her daughter's skin, memorizing it all over again. "You're so beautiful," Norma whispered. "You grew up." "I did," Jennifer smiled. "We grow up there, too. We learn. We watch. I've seen every concert, Dad. I saw you at the Astrodome. I saw you break the records. I was cheering the loudest." George wiped his face with his sleeve, trying to compose himself, though his hands were still shaking. "You saw that?" "I saw it all," she affirmed. "But I also saw the nights you sat in the truck and just stared at the stars. I saw the times you wanted to quit." "I did want to quit," George admitted, his voice raspy. "After you left, the music felt empty. It felt like I was selling pieces of my heart to strangers." "But you didn't quit," Jennifer said fiercely. "You kept singing, and that's what matters. Your voice, it's a rope, Daddy. It's a rope that connects people to their feelings, and it connects you to me. When you sing Baby Blue, the bridge gets stronger." She stepped back slightly, taking one hand of George's and one of Norma's. The light in the creek began to pulse, growing brighter. "I can't stay much longer," Jennifer said, her voice tinged with a sweet sadness. "The tear is closing." Panic flared in Norma's eyes again. "No, not yet. Just a little longer. Please." "Mama," Jennifer said gently, "we had the hug. We had the moment. If I stay, the balance breaks. If you stay, you lose the time you have left. And you have time left." She looked at George. "You have work to do, Dad." "Work?" George scoffed softly. "I'm an old man, Jennifer. I'm done chasing the charts." "Not that kind of work," she corrected. "You have to show people how to endure. You have to show them that a broken heart still beats. That's your job now, to be the cowboy who stayed in the saddle." She squeezed their hands one last time. "I have a message," she said. "A message I need you to take back to the house." "What is it?" Norma asked, leaning in. Jennifer looked at the blue ribbon in Norma's hand. "Tell them that love isn't a straight line," she said. "It's a circle. Nothing ends. We just go around the bend. I'm just around the bend in the road. I'm not in the ground, Mama. I'm not in that box you visit. I'm in the wind. I'm in the song. I'm right here." She placed her hand over George's heart. "And tell them to keep the radio on," she grinned, a flash of her old mischievous self. "I like the new stuff, but I prefer the classics." George laughed, a short, wet, choked laugh that felt like a victory. "You would." The light around their feet began to recede, pulling back toward the center of the creek, pulling back toward Jennifer. The temperature began to rise. The biting cold was being replaced by the humid warmth of the Texas night. "You have to go back to the bank now," Jennifer said. "Go. Don't look back until you're on the grass." Norma hesitated, clinging to Jennifer's hand. "Go, Mama," Jennifer said firmly. "Trust me. I'm safe. I'm happy. And I'll be waiting when the time is actually right." George put his arm around Norma's waist. He knew they had to obey. The energy in the air was shifting, becoming unstable. The static was turning into a low rumble. "Come on, Norma," George said softly. "Let's go home." They stepped back. It was the hardest physical movement George had ever made. To turn his back on his daughter was agony, but he knew it was necessary. They waded backward at first, eyes locked on her, until they reached the shallow edge. Jennifer stood in the center, glowing brighter and brighter. She raised her hand in a wave. "Bye, Daddy. Bye, Mama. See you down the road." George turned Norma around, and they stepped up onto the muddy bank. Their boots hit the dry dirt. The familiar crunch of gravel and dead grass greeted them. "Don't look back," George reminded her, remembering the old stories,
remembering Jennifer's command. They walked up the slope, hand in hand, their backs to the miracle. Behind them, the sound of the rushing light grew louder, like a waterfall, like a jet engine, and then silence. The silence that followed the roar of the light was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with a sudden, blinding whiteness that swallowed the orchard, the creek bed, and the dark Texas sky. George felt the ground beneath his boots dissolve, not into nothingness, but into a sensation of weightlessness. He was still holding Norma's hand, her grip tight and reassuring, but the sensory details of the rough terrain, the thorns, the rocks, the uneven slope, faded into a singular, encompassing warmth. It was as if the sun had decided to rise not from the horizon, but from within the very air around them. The brilliance was absolute, forcing George to close his eyes tight. Behind his eyelids, the image of Jennifer burned bright, a silhouette of grace framed in silver and gold, waving that final, cheerful goodbye. The vibration that had started in the creek bed hummed through his entire body, a resonant frequency that seemed to be knitting together the frayed edges of his soul. He felt a deep, narcotic drowsiness wash over him, a compelling urge to surrender to a rest he hadn't known he needed. The last thing he registered was the smell of vanilla and the phantom sensation of a small hand patting him on the back, whispering that everything was okay. Then the world shifted. The white light slowly reorganized itself. It cooled, shifting from a blinding magnesium flare to the soft, dusty rose of a Texas dawn. The sensation of floating was replaced by the familiar, solid comfort of wood and wicker. The silence of the void was broken by the tentative, waking chirp of a cardinal. George opened his eyes. He was back on the porch. He was sitting in his rocking chair, his body angled slightly toward the east. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and fiery oranges, the sun just beginning to peek over the distant ridge of the hill country. The air was cool, carrying the moisture of the morning dew, a stark contrast to the supernatural freeze of the creek or the oppressive heat of the previous evening. He blinked, disoriented. His heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm, devoid of the panic that had gripped him in the orchard. He looked down at his hands. They were resting on the armrests of the chair. They were not glowing. They were just his hands, weathered, veined, the hands of a man who had worked hard and played hard. Was it a dream? The rational part of his brain, the part that dealt with contracts and cattle prices, immediately tried to assert control. "You fell asleep," it whispered. "You and Norma sat out here to watch the sunset, the heat got to you, and you both drifted off. The grief, the anniversary coming up, it all manifested in a shared dream, that's all." It was a comforting explanation. It was logical. It was safe. But then he looked at his boots. There, on the toe of his left boot, was a smear of fresh, silver-gray mud. Not the dry red dust that covered the rest of the ranch during this drought. This was wet, river-bottom clay. He reached down and touched it. It was damp. It was real. George sat up straighter, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly to look at the rocker beside him. Norma was there. She was asleep, her head lolling slightly to the side, resting against the high back of the chair. But it was the expression on her face that stopped George's breath. For years, decades really, Norma had slept with a furrow in her brow, a tension in her jaw, as if she were fighting off nightmares even in her rest. The grief had etched lines of permanent sorrow around her mouth. But now, her face was smooth.
The tension was gone. Her mouth was curved in a slight, peaceful smile, the kind of smile a child wears after a perfect day of play. She looked 10 years younger. The gray in her hair seemed softer in the morning light. She looked like the woman he had married, the woman who used to laugh freely before the tragedy of 1986 locked a part of her away. And then George saw her hand. Her right hand was resting in her lap, unclenched, relaxed. But woven through her fingers, trailing down over her denim skirt, was a ribbon, a blue ribbon. George froze. He knew that ribbon. He knew exactly where that ribbon was supposed to be.
It was supposed to be inside a cedar box, wrapped in tissue paper, on the top shelf of the closet in the guest room, the room that had been Jennifer's. Norma hadn't opened that box in 5 years because it was too painful. She certainly hadn't brought it out to the porch last night. He reached out, his hand trembling, and lightly touched the silk. It was cool and smooth. It was real. It wasn't a hallucination. Norma stirred. She took a deep breath, inhaling the morning air, and opened her eyes. She didn't wake up with a start or a gasp. She woke up slowly, blinking against the rising sun, stretching her arms like a cat. She turned to George, and her eyes were clear. The glassy, haunted look of the previous evening was gone, replaced by a serene clarity. "Morning," she said softly. Her voice was not the fragile whisper of the woman who had walked into the dark. It was strong. It was grounded. George couldn't speak. He just pointed at the ribbon in her hand. Norma looked down. She saw the blue silk threaded through her fingers. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look shocked. She smiled, a smile of profound, secret knowledge. She lifted the ribbon to her face and pressed it against her cheek, closing her eyes for a moment to savor the contact. "We went, didn't we?" George whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. Norma opened her eyes and looked at him. "We went. We crossed the creek, George." "But how?" George asked, looking out at the yard. The dogs were sleeping lazily by the barn. The horses were grazing in the distance. The world looked completely normal. How is that possible? "Does it matter?" Norma asked. She sat up and began to wind the ribbon around her wrist, tying it in a loose knot. "Does it matter how the mechanics of it work? We saw her. We held her. She told us to keep going. That's all that matters." George looked at the mud on his boot again. He thought about the physics of it, the impossibility of it. Then he thought about the feeling of Jennifer's hand on his back. He thought about the weight of her in his arms. He realized that trying to dissect the miracle would only diminish it. Some things were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be received. "You're right," George said, leaning back in his chair. He felt a weight lift off his own shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety about Norma's well-being, the fear that her grief would eventually consume her, it was gone. She had been to the other side. She had received the reassurance she needed, and she had come back whole. Norma stood up. She didn't use the armrests for leverage. She stood up with energy. "I'm going to make coffee," she announced, "and then I think I'm going to make pancakes, the blueberry ones." She hadn't made blueberry pancakes in 30 years. They were Jennifer's favorite. George watched her walk to the screen door. She paused, with her hand on the handle, and looked back at him. "She's happy, George," Norma said firmly. "She's really happy. We don't have to worry about her being lonely or cold or scared. She's just around the bend." "I know," George said. "I believe it." Norma went inside, the screen door slapping shut behind her with a familiar, comforting sound. George heard her humming in the kitchen a moment later. It wasn't a sad tune. It was an upbeat country shuffle. George remained on the porch for a long time. He watched the sun detach itself from the horizon and begin its climb, painting the Texas sky in brilliant shades of blue. The heat of the day was starting to build, the cicadas were beginning their morning warm-up, the ranch was coming alive. He thought about the message Jennifer had given them. The voice is a rope. He thought about his career, the thousands of shows, the millions of miles. He had often wondered in recent years if it was time to hang up the hat, to park the bus for good. He had felt that perhaps he had said everything he needed to say. But Jennifer had told him to keep the radio on. She had told him to keep singing because the song was the connection. He stood up, his joints protesting slightly less than usual. He walked to the edge of the porch, leaning against the railing where the paint was peeling slightly. He looked out toward the orchard. In the daylight, the trees were just trees. The creek bed, he knew, would be dry if he walked down there now. The silver river was gone, returned to whatever reservoir of grace it had flowed from. But the feeling remained. A gentle breeze kicked up from the south, rustling the leaves of the live oaks. It swept across the porch, cooling the sweat on George's brow. He closed his eyes and listened. In the wind, beneath the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow, he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A hum, a melody. And baby blue was the color of her eyes. It wasn't a haunting. It was a greeting. George smiled. He reached up and adjusted his hat, tilting the brim down just a fraction. He looked up at the vast, open sky, that endless Texas blue that stretched on forever, a dome of infinite possibility. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind. He stood there for a moment longer, letting the sun warm his face, feeling the peace settle into his bones like a heavy, warm blanket. The grief was still there. It would always be there, because the love was still there. But the sting was gone. The wound had been cleaned and dressed. It was no longer an open sore. It was a scar, a mark of survival, a testament to a love that was stronger than death. George turned around and walked toward the door. He could smell the coffee brewing. He could smell the batter on the griddle. He could hear his wife humming in the kitchen. Life continued. The road went on. And somewhere, just around the bend, just past the limit of his vision, the music was playing. He opened the door and stepped inside, letting the screen door slam shut behind him one last time, leaving the dusty road and the empty chair to the morning light.